I think I went a little fast last time. Some people got dizzy. I'll try not to get too fast this time, so I apologize for that. But yeah, I was trying to get it all in. It's just a lot to cover, and it is pretty complex. Yes. Sure. Right, and we're planning on the last session to have where we can talk a little bit about all this, try to straighten it all out a little better. So anyway, where we left off last time, we're talking about science as a general principle. I got an echo here, but anyway, and naturalism. We're talking about philosophy, and so we covered a lot of those areas, and we were looking at some of the problems about just how we do science and be aware of those things, so that we don't get confused just because we use the word scientist or whatever and think, well, that's the be-all, end-all. So we need to be aware of those things. And then this is just giving you a few. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but this just gives you some idea of some of the things that are going on in the universities and the school systems. That materialism is rampant, and like this professor, he had talked about our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises. And then he goes on, it says, they compel us to accept material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So, that gives sort of his a priori prejudice that he has, and that's common. And of course, this professor says, I want atheism to be true, and I made uneasy to the fact that some intelligent, well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't that I don't believe in God, and naturally I hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Now, with the scientific method, of course, we shouldn't come to it with some of these prejudices or already have an a priori commitment to materialism or anything else. If you're just doing science, you should try to discover. So during the explosion of the scientific revolution that came on with the Enlightenment, there sort of became a formulation of an approach to science. You do observations, you are trying to find out what's going on, discover phenomenon, or describe them, or a problem that you're looking to solve, and then you do research about that. You investigate, you collect data, you analyze it, and then you make a hypothesis eventually. You try to come up with some formulation or explanation, a solution, and then you do testing about it. You do trials, experiments to see if what you're doing is valid. And so that is the science that, that we are used to in that sense. And so it's about repeatable events. And so that's a type of science. We mentioned earlier when we were looking at the philosophy also that, we've got to look at a different kind of science, though, when we talk about historical events. They're unique. They're not repeatable. You can't take them and put those in the laboratory and repeat them. You can't do those things again. So that's the difference between this kind of science and what we have to look at when we're talking about origins, for instance. Now, in the Bible, we find the scientific method. I just found these two examples I thought were interesting. Of course, the one that back in Samuel, where the Philistines, having all this trouble with the Ark of the Covenant, and they want to get it out of there. They said, well, if there's anything to this, let's do this sort of an experiment. What they were really doing, they said, get these two cows that have just have calved, and now hitch them up to this cart and pin them up, and then send it on its way and keep watching it. If it goes up to its own territory towards Beth Shemesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it doesn't, then we'll know that it's not His hand that struck us and that it happened to us by chance. So that's like an experiment, and it's using really all the aspects that we talk about with the experimental method. And then in Daniel does an experiment. He talks about to the guard and convinces them to do this trial, a test, that they're going to eat this vegetarian diet and then make a comparison to those that ate from the king's table. And so the experimental method actually has been in the Bible all along, it's more formulated then finally with the Enlightenment. Now, there are some presuppositions when you do science, and you just need to be aware of those so that we're not blown away and led into all these fallacies that we studied in previous weeks about all these different fallacies that can occur in our thinking if we don't understand, assumptions. You've got to understand assumptions or you can get fooled as to what's going on. So one of the assumptions we spent a lot of time on is that truth exists and can be known, and then the laws of nature are orderly and consistent, effects have causes, and causes in the past produce the same effects in the present. Now, we want to look at that later on as we get into the fossil record and other things that happen again about unique events. We need to consider that, and also the role of catastrophism. And when we have catastrophes, things change. Again, those are unique events, though. So as a general rule, we would expect causes in the past produce the same effects in the present. Our senses give us an accurate information about the real world, and the immaterial laws of logic and mathematics apply to the material world. We've already talked about that one as well, how that the laws and the actions of logic and math are really actually are supernatural. They're beyond the universe. They exist outside of what we really think of in space and time. They exist in minds, and that's where those things come from. And so, but again, that's how the world is described. And then we have free will to make choices and to follow evidence where it leads. And that's a contradiction. We studied that last time again about the whole idea that if we're just molecules in motion, if we're just moist robots or carbon-based structures, nothing more, then how can we even trust our own thinking? I mean, if that's all we are, if it's just a whole bunch of randomness, then how do we even know that anything we're thinking is valid? And so that poses a problem there. If we don't have that basis, it's very difficult to know how can we communicate really truth to anyone or even come to truth. And then we can make rational inferences from accurately collected data. That's critical, again, to be able to think and to use logic. And then there's a moral obligation to accurately report the findings of our research. And of course, that's a big problem if we don't do that. And we're seeing that, boy, more and more about, not following through with what we actually found, misleading information. Now, there is a faith in the scientists, and here's one here. Science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Even the most atheistic scientists accept as an act of faith the existence of a law-like order in nature that, at least in part, is comprehensible to us. So again, this whole idea of even though in the scientific world now it seems like everybody pushes back, they are having a type of faith. Again, these are assumptions, and so there's no way to go beyond them when you have an assumption. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, the corruption of the scientific endeavor is something we face a lot. I've seen it a whole lot lately, and it's getting worse and worse. So one of the things is, and that's one of the things that drove me crazy doing research earlier, and I finally went in to just go into private practice. But the chief goal is to get more funding. If you don't have funding, if you don't get your grants, you're doomed. And so you're going to do what it takes to get funding. And then the quantity of publication output has become more important than the quality. You've got to produce. You've got to have lots of papers, or you're going to get pushed aside. Applied research is more valuable than the basic research. Big business, the non-governmental organizations, government agencies, all these control the funding. And so they vie to have scientific reports, quote unquote, published that put their products, their policies, their actions in the best possible light. And so that corrupts science. And then peer review process has become essentially a way to maintain the party line rather than trying to put real input a lot of times. A lot of times the peer review process is determining who gets published or not as gatekeepers to really continue to follow the narrative that's in vogue at the time. And so they're beholden, of course, because they hold the keys to getting your research funding. So it's a very difficult thing that's going on, and we see this a lot as what's happening. Dr. Spencer, some of you know him, Roy Spencer, a great guy that's done tremendous research having to do with global warming issues. He can speak volumes about this, and then it happens tons of time in our medical research. So it's a real problem. So you have to be aware of these things. Now this gets over to where I was talking about a minute ago, about how there's difference between experimental science versus historical science. So that's a different thing to deal with, and we have to think about it differently. The assumptions are going to be different, and we need to understand that, or we can get confused and led astray as to how things are going. So there's some different areas we need to look at. Cosmology has to do with the universe, beginnings, things like that. There's historical geology, we mentioned briefly about the fossil record, and paleontology that deals with that. Paleoclimatology, archaeology, paleography, historical criticism is an important area. And of course, that's had a lot of effects sometimes. It's really been beneficial, though, of being able to then know more and more about our biblical documents. And that applies to any historically old writings. You're trying to find out who were the authors really, what was the time frame, is this valid, is this what they meant to communicate from that time period, and is it a true document. And then forensics. Again, we mentioned that at the beginning about the idea that you're looking at evidence. You don't have as much evidence as you do in experimental sciences, and you take what you've got and then try to reason or infer to the best possible explanation. That's of course what happens in a murder trial, for instance, but also is used a lot all the time in medicine. That's what we do. That's why it's called taking a history. The patient comes in, we got to spend some time just trying to probe what are they telling us, what really happened. We're trying to reconstruct what went on and got them to the place they are now in their particular illness. And so it's used in medicine and law a lot of times. And then, so looking at some of these cosmological theories, there's been a lot of them. Of course, one that was around for a long time is the steady state universe, that, the universe has always been here. It didn't have a beginning. We did look at previously about some of the great thinkers that we looked at with Aristotle and others of Greece, that they did propose the idea of a beginning because of the problem with the infinite regress. We mentioned that in the philosophical arguments. And then really the Big Bang came in to begin to appear as a thought as to what was going on in the 1920s. And Einstein was trying to solve his equations, and Hubble was doing his research, and eventually come together this idea that the universe had a beginning and that it came into being. So that really changed a lot. A lot of people weren't happy with it. I guess I got these out of order. The oscillating universe, I guess, in a way, really came after that. It's been around in the past. Some of the other opposing Greek thinkers had proposed that idea as well, that the universe was here and then they shrink or go down and come back or something like that. But the oscillating universe was like, okay, maybe there was a Big Bang, but it just goes back and forth all the time, and so it doesn't really have a beginning. But the problem with that, and that's been kind of fallen by the wayside, although it tries to be resurrected periodically, is the thermodynamics would still say that eventually that's like if you take a ball, it bounces, it gradually goes down. You're going to continue to lose energy and entropy even if you have multiple oscillations. And then there's inflation. So these more recent ones have come along as inflationary cosmology, string theory, quantum cosmology. There's a whole bunch of these, multiverse, wormholes. Dr. Guthrie here could blow your mind talking about all these different things. He blows my mind regularly when we get together. He tries to explain things like this. It's just way out there. But anyway, these things, especially obviously the multiverse, the idea that there's just multiple universes and it's a big spinning wheel. And we just looked out that ours is like this, but there's a whole bunch more. But that's obviously totally unobservable. We have no information on this. We have no way of finding it. Nobody has ever seen it. So, it's not really anything that we can say is legitimate. Now, I did want to point out, I've got some books up here. This book, of course, it's our own Noby Stone. It really has a lot of this stuff in it in a way that's pretty accessible, I think, to anyone that's non-science or whatever. It's pretty good, and it goes through some of these things about these things. So Genesis 1, Novi Spellman book, it's very good, and that's something you might want to get if you're interested in going a little deeper. Now, but again, there's no way to observe that there are multiple universes. That's purely conjecture. And you talk about having faith, well, that's a faith. So that's quite a bit of faith, I guess. So let's see if we can learn something here.
What got you excited about dark matter in the first place?
Well, I left string theory, which I've been working on for a long time, and everyone was talking about how cool dark matter was, and I thought, well, sure, I'll give that a go.
So it's your rebound science.
What's that?
Well, not the science you spend the rest of your life with, but the one you use to make yourself feel pretty again.
But if I'm being honest, I never forgot about string theory. It's remarkable. It's the closest we've come to a theory of everything. Something even Einstein couldn't figure out.
Well, if he couldn't figure it out, maybe it's just wrong.
All right. So anyway, maybe it's just wrong. So did the universe have a beginning? So this, again, sort of fits with the Big Bang Theory and even with the Genesis account then, is this idea we talked about previously, the infinite regress, that you just can't have an infinity that just keeps going back because you never would arrive at today. I mean, if time has always existed in the past infinitely, then how do you get to today? And that was the thought of the Greek philosophers that had originally talked about it. And then it was, magnified more. We talked about last time in the Kalam cosmological argument. And then there's the second law of thermodynamics we mentioned briefly, the idea that an understanding that the energy is used as it continues to have more and more entropy to it. It seeks to fill the space and becomes more and more disordered. And so eventually there's just total heat death and nothing going on. If it was infinite, we would have arrived at a heat death. General relativity, again, we mentioned, was one of the driving factors in solving those equations that would lead Hawking to say about the Big Bang, confirming it again, what Hubble had proposed through the red shift of the Doppler effect. Just like when you hear a train and it goes past you, there's a change in the frequency that you hear. The same thing's true with light. So with that, as he looks off into space, and the telescopes got better, and they were able to look through our galaxy out to see that there were all these other galaxies out there. Finally, that everything was expanding because of the red shift, and so there's this rush out. So it's like, well, that obviously would mean that something had been inward, and now it's rushing out, and that gave credence to the idea of a Big Bang. And then the abundance of helium would be another evidence, and the background microwave radiation was another big thing. The researchers at Bell Labs discovered that there was this uniform background radiation they found that would be consistent with this initial the deployment of the Big Bang that was diffused through the universe, and it's even all throughout. And so that was important. Now, more recently, there's been some newer developments coming on board that not only is it expanding, you would think at some point there had been concern that maybe it would just collapse back in at some point. You only go so far, and then it gradually just come back in on itself, and that would give rise maybe to this oscillating universe. But I guess Einstein didn't think there was enough matter to be able to bring it back together. But now they're saying instead of that, what's happening is it's not just going outward, it's actually going out at an ever-increasing rate. That it gets faster and faster, and which really is odd and hard to understand. And so that's where the whole idea, as he referenced a minute ago, about dark matter, that there's more mass out here pulling it outward. This idea of dark matter and dark energy that's playing a role here. But anyway, a lot of that's very theoretical. I refer you to Dr. Guthrie if you want to get into detail. But I only go so far. I'm just eager to get to biology. We're not getting there today, but that's, of course, my love, where I'm at. So anyway, we'll get there soon. So here are some observations then about the universe that we need to contend with, and those that we encountered in our discussions as apologists. The universe appears to have a beginning, and we've got good evidence for that. The universe appears to be fine-tuned for human life. That is, that not just life, but human life, and the difference there is all those things we mentioned earlier about consciousness and about thought and being able to make reasoning work, and also that it's as though that it's meant for an observer, that we can actually observe and do these experiments and learn things. So that special characteristic. And life appears to have emerged from non-life, which again is a principle that we don't see. It's violating a principle of abiogenesis, that we know that life does not emerge from non-life. But yet, for this to occur, it had to be this at some point. And then living organisms appear to be designed. We'll spend a lot of time on that. Human consciousness appears to have emerged from unconscious matter. Human free will appears to have emerged from an otherwise deterministic universe that, functions by laws, the laws of physics. And yet, that's non-deterministic. So how do you get non-deterministic free will from a deterministic universe? And then there's transcendent objective moral truth that's universally acknowledged. We spent some time on that in the philosophy arguments. And then evil and injustice persist despite all human efforts to control it. These are problems, but these are the observations we have in the world. And so not only do we want to give an answer for it, but the one who may have questions, they're looking ultimately for these answers. And the answers aren't satisfactory, I propose, on those that are taking the materialistic or naturalistic stand. Now, what is biblical cosmology? We saw that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He is the maker of the Bear and the Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the south. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed and miracles that cannot be counted. This is what God the Lord says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made of what was visible. So that is the underlying fundamental biblical cosmology there. And it is interesting here, and there's a lot of, I hope to have some more time to spend on this, of biblical foreknowledge, of things that, how would these people know this, if they weren't inspired? There's a lot of instances of biblical foreknowledge. And this whole idea of stretching out the heavens, well, that fits really good with the Big Bang. It's stretched out. And that's what the Big Bang says, that He stretched it out, and that He created it from what was not visible. That's what the Big Bang says too, that it came out of nothing. And so here we find in these ancient scriptures truths that are greatly antedate our world today of just arriving at some of these things. Now, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. That's really true today, isn't it? He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers, or rulers and authorities. All things were created by Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. Again, this whole idea of holding together is a critical thing about physics. And I hope to get to that again. That's another topic with Mike Guthrie that we have about how things are held together, and it's just more and more we see it. It's like, yeah, there's something really mysterious and mystifying how this can stay together. Now, we need to consider about known and unknown, and this is an important topic. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. So there is this dichotomy going on, and I'm sure we all struggle with it and try to understand it. We'll spend more time on it off and on here, but the old earth versus young earth creationists. So the time is an issue, a stumbling block to people a lot of times about big numbers of time that are thrown out. So that's something to be aware of, and we need to consider that, is understanding about time. And time is something that's very difficult topic to understand. And it's something that, again, with Mike Guthrie talking about it, just the whole concept of the physics of time is very not well understood at all. And there's a whole lot that we don't understand about how time works. But that is something that we want to consider and look at. One thing to be aware of, and I think as you read in the Genesis account, and Noby goes through it some here too and looks at some of those, is this possible break, it seems, between Genesis 1 and 2 and then beginning in Genesis 3, just to be aware of that, and we might want to explore that more. And then, of course, understand that, at the beginning He created light, but it wasn't until day 4 that we find that the heavenly bodies were created. And so there's some things going on there, but just like we found out about God stretching out the universe and things like that, we don't need to shut the door on what's going on here with our limited knowledge. And there's a number of ideas that do it. But, one of the things is to consider about starlight and time and how long that takes to travel, and understand that, and different explanations of that. And if you're interested in that, there's a very good discussion about several different competing theories and ideas about starlight and time. I have a book here that goes into some mathematical things, but there's a number in this article here that I can reference, and when we get everything out, it's very good, and it goes through all these different ones. A lot of times it can get into some complicated math, but there's a number of different ideas there. Now, there's been some throw out. One of them is the idea that of time dilation is one, and how that works. So there's some things with that, and there's just a number of other approaches that are being considered here, and how that these earlier days something different was going on about how it worked, obviously, because they didn't have the planets in place and stars until day 4 on this, and be aware of that. And then the plants came on day 3, so you understand that difference there. So there's a number of things to consider. And then here we go. Haven't you read, he replied, and this is Jesus speaking, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, for the two will become one flesh. Now, and we want to get into this probably closer to the end of this series, and looking at historical Christian evidences, that part of the way that we can validate our scriptures is if Jesus makes a specific reference. And so here Jesus does refer specifically to the Genesis account about human life, at least. And so I think at the very least we have to be certain of that foundational statement there from the beginning, he says, about male and female being created. So we have that foundational assertion by Jesus, and that gives us validation for most of our Old Testament passages when he refers to the book of Job and makes references to Psalms and all these different things. So he even refers to Jonah. So that helps us to validate what is the biblical canon. Now, part of the divine purpose is the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. And so this gets a little bit to what Paul will say here in a minute, but it's a speech that everybody can have access to. And we're learning more and more about that speech as physics and astrophysics and astronomy looks at the stars. And then there's also the non-human life. So we have the natural world, the physical world, the physics, and then we have the non-human life. And God says to reproduce after their kind. And so that's a very important principle that we'll look at, is this idea that the non-human life is going to reproduce after its kind. And that's totally different than what evolution of Darwinian or neo-Darwinism would propose. So we're going to deal with that in the biology section. And then it says, be fruitful and increase in numbers, fill the earth and subdue it, to the humans. And in a way that speaks to maybe our false god of environmentalism in the wrong way. We're supposed to be good stewards, but we're not to worship the earth. of course. We're to subdue it. We're to use it. It's a tool. And we're not to destroy it, but we're also not to be so afraid to use it and the things that he's put in the earth. Now, so design demands a designer. We've talked about that in philosophy. Here's what the scripture says. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what is made. From what is made, so men are without excuse. So there's all this evidence, is what he's saying, that gives us a reason to think these things. So how do we detect design? There's some principles about how you detect design when you encounter something. It's evidence of intentional or chosen activity or some intervention. It's something that obviously has been done to something else, and it appears to have been done intentionally. Some decision was made. And so that has to do with the initiation. It's got to be a complex or improbable product or arrangements, things that wouldn't expect to have just happened by chance or accident. So it's complex in that way. And then it's a presence of functional or specified information that communicates that some kind of information is being put into the system or being used to act on the system. So those are how you detect design. So here's an example: intentional complexity and specificity. So that first line, it is complex. And so it does meet that criteria, but it's obviously not specified. The bottom one is has specificity, but it's not complex. It's just a repeated pattern over and over. And so then the one in the middle meets both criteria. And then so crystals fall into that last category. They're following a certain pattern, repetitive. So crystals do have, that kind of thing going on, a specificity, but it's not complex. It looks complex, but it's not, because it's actually got a formula that it has to do. Now, here is a different level of complexity, so we know that these jets couldn't have been produced accidentally. It meets both criteria, and so does this that I had up earlier, that we wouldn't think, if we ran upon that in the woods and we're exploring in South Dakota, we wouldn't say, well, look at that, erosion. If you give it enough time, billions of years, that's what happens. Okay, now, is this the result of a cosmic explosion? When you think about the complexity of our solar system, for instance, when you see what Kepler and Galileo did and the mathematics and how these things work, it's obviously following these rules, but it is going to be, it seems, in somewhat like that last category in a way, but yet it is quite complex. So it has a little bit of both elements, and it gives rise to the thought that there has been some information and intelligence acting on it to set it in motion and to have it all set up the right way, because the actions of these things is not random. Now, the anthropic fine-tuning is what was hinted at a little earlier, but in this, it has to do with human life, but it indicates the remarkably improbable degree of specificity. That's very narrow tolerance. In other words, it's, like any physical system has some degree of tolerance or range that it can tolerate and still function. Well, this tolerance is very narrow, required in the physical constants of nature in order to allow for the existence of human life. So there's a very narrow range of tolerance there. And so that's what's surprising to physicists when they started really going through these fine-tuning principles. So Sir Fred Hoyle said that common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed. He has to throw that in, get back, but he's going to use a different word, but it has monkeyed with the physics as well as the chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. And then George Greenstein said, the thought insistently arises that some supernatural agency, or rather agency, must be involved. Is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we have stumbled upon scientific proof for the existence of a supreme being? Was it God who stepped in and so providentially crafted the cosmos for our benefit. And then Paul Davies, famous physicist, said, "It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." And Stephen Hawking, no friend of theism, said, "The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." So what are some of these fine-tunings that go on? So there are properties and forces. When we talk about the foundational fine-tuning, that's sort of like the basis, the underlying is that the properties and forces affecting the behavior of the subatomic particles, the property and forces affecting the behavior of the atoms, and the property and forces affecting the behavior of the stars, and the forces affecting the behavior of galaxies. So those are some real basic things, but they had to all be fine-tuned. There are constants and fine-tuning issues with each of these that have this very narrow tolerance for life to come about. And then some of these I've mentioned here: gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the cosmological constant. That's the one that we mentioned earlier with Einstein's work and Hawking, of how you have to have this constant to explain the speed at which things are expanding. And the velocity of light is a constant. It's critical. The proton-electron mass ratio and the neutron-proton mass ratio. All of these have constants associated with them. They're very fine-tuned. They have to be just where they are. We wouldn't have any of these things. The carbon atom wouldn't exist. The oxygen atom couldn't exist if these other factors weren't in favor. And the other thing is their interaction with each other is so critical, which is really amazing. The gravitational force is the weakest force, and the strong nuclear force is the strongest force. But their difference and their relation to one another is extremely fine-tuned. One of the scientists that was working on this gave a range of amazing number, just this huge, gigantic number I can't comprehend, but like 1 to or 10 to the 34th power, some gigantic number. It says it's more than that's a higher number than all the atoms in the universe. So it's a gigantic number. So anyway, that difference between those two is like that, because the gravitational force is so tiny, but yet so immense all over the universe. But yet the strong nuclear force doesn't act, but in very, very small distances, but it's so much more powerful. So it's all these odd things that you have to think about and consider that had to be finely tuned. And then the regional fine-tuning had to do with the spiral shape of the Milky Way galaxy, how that helps the positioning of the galaxy in the universe, the size of the Milky Way galaxy, the position of the sun in the Milky Way galaxy is in an area that's life-giving, the composition of the sun, the age and mass of the sun, the positioning of the planets. All of these were critical, like, for instance, Jupiter, being this huge, gigantic gas planet that helps to absorb all kinds of debris from space that's coming towards us, and it sucks it in, so we don't get hit all the time with stuff. And then the local fine-tuning is like positioning of the Earth's orbit, positioning of the moon, the atmospheric conditions that we have that allow us to exist. And obviously, if there was a difference there about our position, solar winds would blow away our atmosphere like Venus or Mars, or we'd be a hot greenhouse planet like Venus. So there's all these different conditions. The terrestrial conditions, plate tectonics had to be just right to allow for carbon to predominate like it does. All these things are finely tuned. That's not pretty big. Now, so anyway, there's just an incredible degree of fine-tuning that we see, and to be aware of it. I think we're running out of time, so I'm hitting the time button. But well, we need to talk more about time. Maybe we can create some more here, and we'll be able to do it. But we haven't figured out how to do that. I think Dr. Guthrie's working on it. But at any rate, with physics, so I just want to briefly, because we don't have time for all this, I'm going to spend my time mainly on biology. But just in physics, we were just talking a minute ago, again, of the amazing things that God has done. And when you think about, now we used to think about protons, neutrons, and electrons, but of course now there are all these even further elementary particles that make them up, the different quarks and the different color characteristics inside the proton and the neutron. And then one of it's really fascinating is the tricolor nature of these in the proton and neutron. Again, we had that earlier. We talked about the triune God when we went through that diagram. Well, here it is again in threes. All these different characteristics, the up and down quark, and then the electron and how that one is so unique. All of these things are just to speak of this incredible intelligence that created it all. All right, well, have a good week. I've got some other sources up here if you want to look at them, and we'll get you these references eventually when we get to the last session. Thank you.